Welcome back to the ERP Perspective, where we challenge the way enterprise actually runs. Now, today's conversation is one I've been really looking forward to because we're diving into something every ERP leader feels, but very few are talking about honestly. ERP systems today are more powerful than they've ever been. They're cloud-based, constantly evolving, packed with innovation. And yet, for some organizations, they still feel heavy, they feel slow, and more importantly, they feel hard to operate. So what's going on? Why does ERP work technically but feel so painful operationally? That's exactly what we're unpacking today because maybe, just maybe, ERP isn't the problem. Maybe the real issues is how we're operating it. From managing constant release cycles to handling growing integration complexity to the very real tension between speed and risk, most organizations are being pushed to move faster without increasing headcount while still relying on manual processes to validate critical change. And that's where things start to break. So today we're going beyond the surface. We're going to explore why cloud ERP didn't simplify things the way we expected, where operational models are falling behind modern systems, and what it actually takes to move from reactive ERP projects to running ERP as a continuous confidence-driven operation. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by someone who sits right at the intersection of innovation, enterprise reality, and ERP transformation. Adam Jones, Principal of Innovation and Excellence at Opkey. Adam works closely with organizations navigating Oracle Cloud and modern ERP environments, helping them deal with the real challenge of continuous change, testing, governance, and operational risk. Adam, welcome to the show. Adam, welcome to the ERP Perspective.
Hey, George, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. It's great to have you on the show. And I know this is maybe the third or fourth time we've had Opkey on the ERP Perspective, but you've got such exciting things going on at the moment. And I know the topic of today's discussion, ERP isn't broken, but the way we operate it is. I thought was a great topic for you guys to speak about, and given your background as well, I thought it'd be a great conversation. But before we start, it'd be great if you could give the audience sort of a breakdown of your career and what brought you to present day.
Yeah, George, absolutely. So I bring to Opkey about 15 years experience implementing Oracle Cloud and being part of some of these large scale implementations and really seeing firsthand, what does it mean to bring cloud to life for some of these complex, multifaceted, multi-pillar organizations, and really just be a part of the decision making process, gathering those requirements, putting that in the system itself, and maybe going back to the drawing board, seeing how that actually looks, and actually needing to reconfigure some things. And some of that brings about some difficult conversations, but it's also been, an incredible experience. Been with Opkey for a little over a year now. I came over, I think you've had David Zimmerman on the podcast before. I came over with David and a few others in terms of really seeing the opportunity that Opkey is bringing to the market. I think you are aware of who we are, but in general, Opkey spent the last 10 years or so really bringing great innovation and leading the market in terms of test automation. But in the past year and a half or so, really moving on beyond just test automation and seeing the opportunity and really some of the pain points that organizations are facing. Some of that we'll talk about today. But in terms of configuration and maintenance and expansion of cloud, cloud now has been around about 15 years. And really when I've grown up in my career, my first couple of projects were Oracle EBS and PeopleSoft projects on premise. And then I learned about this exciting new endeavor that is the cloud. And so I said, hey, I've got to make a pivot here, join this cloud revolution, if you will. But that's 15 years ago. So, organizations are now living and breathing in this environment for quite some time. But what we're going to talk about today is, that implementation and maintenance and day in and day out work that's needed to really operate and thrive in a cloud environment hasn't really kept pace with the technology itself. So saw that opportunity at Opkey, and really that's what we've been focused on these past year or so, is just bringing that to market and bringing that to bear.
100%. And I know you've got quite some time within the industry and joined the exciting journey with Opkey as well. I mean, from your point there, I mean, you are totally correct. The ERP systems today are more capable than they've ever been. Cloud integrated and constantly evolving. And yet, for some organizations, they still feel heavy, low, and difficult to operate. I mean, we're seeing frequent release cycles becoming the normal, real cost from fail changes,
Right.
and growing pressure from teams just to keep up. So, I mean, let's start there. What is that sort of disconnect, and why does ERP work technically but feel so painful operationally?
Yeah, I mean that's the tension we see and hear in almost every conversation, right? Not just from IT ERP leaders, but from the implementation partners who are supporting them as well. The technology is exceptional, and that's actually part of the problem. As we said, the technology has evolved dramatically these last 15 years, but the way organizations absorb the changes and operate within it hasn't kept pace. Majority of organizations who have moved to the cloud, they're faced with up to managing up to 3 or more major releases each year, some even 7 or more. On paper, that sounds great, right? You're getting all the innovation, you're getting the upgrades, but it can be overwhelming for organizations that are not prepared for it. You're from the UK, right, George? So maybe your audience may have to pardon the analogy here, but you've essentially got a Formula One car being driven by a team that's more accustomed to developing and maintaining their own rally car out in their garage, right? With the
Mm.
rally car, they've had full control and the latitude to make upgrades and changes on their own timeline and scale. With Formula One, you have the bleeding edge performance and continuous innovation, but at the cost of being at the mercy of the formula regulations. It can be a bit of a shock to the system for organizations that are not prepared or knowledgeable about that shift. We see, I think we mentioned our survey coming into this podcast, right? But we see all of this proven out in the data. We just completed our survey of over 200 IT leaders in our 2026 State of ERP Testing and Calm report. I think David introduced Calm maybe on the prior discussion that you had with them, but we call this the Cloud Application Lifecycle Management. That's essentially what we're calling our platform, right? To manage the full end-to-end life cycle from configuration to testing to expansion and optimizing these cloud platforms. But over half of those IT leaders that we surveyed have experienced some significant annual costs from production failures. And those costs can range from 500,000 to over $5 million, depending on the scale of the organization. 42% report an inability to staff the ongoing effort just to maintain the system appropriately. And the average organization is sending about 30 cents for every dollar spent on enterprise apps to external consultants, often for just the recurring operations, not that high value strategic advisory work that partners want to be doing and that organizations crave. The bottom line is that the technology moved to continuous delivery, continuous innovation, but the operating model has stayed in that project mode.
Well, I mean, some of those stats that you mentioned there are, yeah, mind blowing to think about. I mean, just on our latest episode, we had Eric Kimberling on the show, and he was telling me about the technology innovation or the innovation within ERP. It's kind of like a hockey stick if you were going to have it on a graph, but then the business adoption and the business actual innovation is more of a gradual sort of diagonal line in a way that's not obviously meeting technology and obviously the advancements of ERP systems and going to the cloud it's massive at the moment, but there's a lot of wastage, and as you mentioned, it's becoming more of a hindrance maybe for certain businesses.
Yeah, and look, it's accelerating. I mean, you talk that hockey stick
Mm.
analogy is so true because I mean, even if I go back 5 years, I mean, prior to COVID, I mean, it's like you could see things were changing a little bit. I mean, on the Oracle side, they had their third big facelift in terms of the UI UX moving to this Redwood user experience, a more simplified consumer and kind of what Oracle calls a consumer plus experience, moving away from admins maintaining the systems, moving towards employee self-service and manager self-service. But now with AI, there's a term going out in the industry. AI is the new UI, and that innovation and pace of change has really hit an inflection point, really in the last year, maybe even in the last 6 months, where that pace of change, not only has it been continuous and constant over these last, 5 to 10 years, but that's accelerating now going into 2026. And as more agentic AI capabilities get built into these native applications, I mean, I feel for organizations because it's so much to take on so quickly, and everybody's having to adapt in real time.
100%. And on that topic, if ERP itself isn't broken and the real problem is the way organizations are operating it, where do you see the biggest gaps today in managing change, as we mentioned there, handling releases and actually preparing the business for what's being deployed?
Yeah, so I think here's what's interesting. When you ask people where the gaps actually are, you'd expect them to say testing, change management. That's the obvious answer. But the
Mm,
data tells a bit of a different story, right? The gaps start way earlier in the life cycle itself. When we ask IT leaders which tasks are hardest to do manually, the number one answer was the time and effort to configure new features, not
mm,
to test those features, but to actually get in the system and configure them. 46% said just identifying which configuration changes are needed for the business. What what do we actually need and are wanting to do when it comes to the innovation that Oracle or Workday or SAP is putting out there? So being able to assess from what you have currently and what your day to day looks like, do you have innovations? Do you have enhancement requests that you've put out there that have now finally come to fruition? Things that are going to actually add quality to your business is very difficult for these companies to kind of understand on a quarter, week to week, quarter, semi annual basis.
mm.
45% said they don't even have a clear picture of what their current business processes are. As a former implementer that was doing this day in and day out, I can tell you, we go in, we document hundreds, sometimes thousands of business processes. We spend months working with the customer across multiple, stakeholder groups, multiple ownership and processes and swim lane owners, and define what or understand what their current state is, but then move to what the future state would look like and document all of that in process maps. And the reality is we go live, those process maps get put on a SharePoint somewhere, and they are more often than not maintained or even lost over time, right? Because people leave the organization, people move to different roles, and that there's a ton of knowledge, understanding, decisions that can sometimes get lost. So even just knowing what's going on can be a challenge.
Yeah.
Think about what this means for a partner walking into a client engagement.
Mm.
Nearly half of these organizations cannot confidently tell you how their system is actually configured, what those decisions were, or what their real end-to-end processes look like. There's somebody that's, probably has that domain knowledge that some other folks may not necessarily be aware of all the time. That's not a testing gap. That's a discovery gap.
Yeah, if anything, I think that's quite concerning. There might be some CIOs or business owners watching this podcast now and thinking, 50% of my staff or 50% of organizations, as you mentioned, don't understand those end-to-end processes or aren't aware on how they operate. No wonder we have such a high rate of projects that don't proceed or don't fulfill the objectives that we were looking to achieve.
Right.
How recent were them stats collected?
Yeah, so this is just hot off the press. That
Lovely.
we're excited to be publishing. If it didn't get published this week, I think it's going out next week. But yeah, happy to work with you and your audience and make sure you get that at your fingertips. Going back to the realities, right? If you can't see it, you can't validate it, you can't document it, you can definitely can't tell what the business, what is coming with that expected change in a release. And what we tell partners, right, is this is a massive opportunity for them.
Mm.
The firm that can go to an organization and crack discovery and overall impact analysis, walk into a client and say, here's exactly what is changed or is going to change. Here's what it touches in your application. And here's what needs to be validated. Those are the partners that are going to shift from being reactive in their relationship with their client or customer to being more strategic and indispensable really to their operations. And right now, too much of the engagement model has been and is firefighting, right? Optimizing, going in and just trying to fix things. The data tells us the gap really starts upstream. End of the day, many organizations are running a 2026 tech stack, 2016 operating model. And at Opkey, right, we're doing everything we can to help customers and also partners shift their mindset and methodology to take advantage of the exciting innovations available in ERP today.
So, I mean, going on to the cloud topics, I mean, cloud ERP was supposed to simplify everything. But as you mentioned, we're seeing, more releases, more integrations, more moving parts than we've ever experienced. I mean, in fact, for many organizations, interactions are now one of the biggest operational cost drivers, as you mentioned. So what did organizations misunderstand when they moved to cloud ERP? Did we remove complexity or just shift it to somewhere else?
No, I think it's clear, right? We organizations, we absolutely shifted it. I'll give you the number that really tells the whole story. From our survey, again, 61% of organizations in the survey said integrations are their single highest cost driver. 61%. And that's nearly double what the next category was. And what do you think that one is, right? It's
Yeah.
it's the ongoing management of those same integrations. So think about what the cloud promise was. Simplify the core application, let the vendor handle the infrastructure, let the business focus on the actual value it's bringing to their organization. The core application did get simpler in many ways. I think the UI and UX that we talked about earlier, I mean, for getting fingers on the keyboard, getting more folks involved and just managing their own data, reducing the overall headcount to service those level 1, tier 0 tickets. So it's much simpler to use. But what happened is that complexity migrated outward to the seams between systems in those integrations. So an organization's ERP talks to their CRM talks to their ITSM, and the procurement platform talks to all of them. And the average enterprise in our survey is running Workday, Salesforce, ServiceNow, and often Oracle or SAP alongside those. And every quarterly update to any one of those applications has the potential to break something downstream or upstream in another. And here's what makes this particularly relevant, I think, for the partner community, right? Is that the integration work is where so much of that post go live engagement lives. And it's the thing that keeps the phone ringing for those partners, day in and day out. But it's also the thing that keeps partners stuck in a more reactive model. And when you're constantly triaging integration breaks after every release cycle, you're not doing that transformational work. You're just doing the maintenance. And both the partner and the client deserve better than that, right? Oracle's actually reinforcing the point themselves, having recently, back in January, moved Oracle Integration Cloud to a quarterly release cycle to coincide with the consumer application. So now it's not just the applications that are updating every quarter, it's the integration layer itself that's now in that same quarterly release cycle. So you've got more change, more validation needed, more potential for things to break. George, absolutely, the complexity didn't disappear. It just migrated out to the seams between applications in those integrations itself.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it sounds like there's a growing tension underneath all this. Teams are under pressure to deliver faster, keep up with those release cycles that you mentioned, and do more without adding headcount. I mean, at the same time, or as the same time as testing and validation still take time and often rely on the manual effort, are organizations now being forced into a trade-off between speed and risk? And in reality, where our corners being cut just to keep things moving along?
Yeah, and I mean they absolutely are, right? And I think most of them know it, and they just don't say it out loud, or they're talking with their partners about how to manage it or how to navigate this, right? I mean, let me describe what actually happens in practice, because I think anyone who's been on a release readiness call or part of these cloud operating models that are managing these quarterly, monthly, semi-annual releases will recognize this, right? On the Oracle side, you've got a quarterly update landing in a couple of weeks. Your team or your partner's team or kind of all in together there, has a finite window to test. You've got 1 or 2 weeks really to get ahead of that when you get your hands on what those features or new upgrades are going to be in your test system prior to actually moving that up to production and deciding what you want to do. You've got to test. You're not able to test everything. We mentioned earlier the pace of change and the pace of innovation has started to accelerate. These release notes that Oracle, Workday, et cetera, are putting out, I mean, those are growing substantially. Some of the recent releases have been some of the biggest I've ever seen. So you're not able to test everything. So the customer's just going to triage what they have, do that normal regression testing. You're going to cover the big ticket processes, right? The payroll runs, you're going to financial close, order to cash. Maybe you get to a handful of your key critical downstream integrations. And then you go live and you hope everything holds, right? Our data shows 73% of organizations are dealing with 3 or more major updates a year. But 42% can't adequately staff the work just to keep up. That math starts to break down. It just doesn't work, right? Something has to give. And what almost always gives, right, is just coverage and overall understanding and being able to accommodate all the various nuances that are critical to your business. Something ultimately gives. And so 20% of organizations told us they see production issues often or almost always with these release cycles. And another 32% says they, see them sometimes. So that's more than half collectively of organizations that we surveyed that are facing significant risks or consequences of not being able, to handle this constant innovation on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis. And here's the reality, right? When we asked about, well, what is that actually costing? 37% absorbing that $500,000 to $2 million cost annually. And there's an unfortunate group, about 15%, seeing a $2 million to $5 million cost on average due to production issues caused by quarterly releases or upgrades to the system, right? So for partners, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, the break fix and these day-to-day reactive behaviors, right? That's work that keeps folks billable. But on the other hand, that's the least differentiated work that a partner can do for a customer. Any firm can staff a regression cycle. The question is, which firms are going to be the ones that help clients get ahead of the problem instead of constantly reacting to it? And I think that's the competitive differentiator for the partner community right now, right? When things break, consultants get called, and over time, that creates a hidden dependency for these organizations.
100%. And the stats that you mentioned there, I'd love to take a look at that report once it is released. I think by the time we have this podcast live, I'll definitely link it below alongside your profile so the audience can see the stats that you were mentioning. And from what you've described, I think this is where it becomes more than just an IT issue. Over time, that pressure starts to show up as, release fatigue, as you mentioned, growing backlogs, increasing reliance on the consultants, and, a loss of confidence in the system itself. I mean, how does this operational drag quietly erode ERP value over time? And why is it often invisible until it starts really affecting the business?
Yeah. Look, this is something that doesn't exactly show up in any dashboard. I think all ERPs now, have beautiful analytics, right? But this is not something that's going to show up necessarily or even be able to be tracked, effectively. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous to these organizations. It is a true risk, right? It's a slow erosion that happens across really 3 dimensions. I think first is this overall, external consultant dependency, right? As stated earlier, our data is showing that on average, about 30 cents of every dollar spent on enterprise application is going to external partners. So you have 67% of organizations relying on consultants for 30% or more of their total spend. Now, I want to be clear, right? There's nothing wrong with using partners. That's my whole career, essentially up till now. But the issue is what they're being used for. When a significant chunk of that spend is just going towards regression testing, keeping the lights on, configuration validation, post-release support, that's not strategic advisory work. And I think in conversations that we have with customers and with partners, they want to be doing that strategic value add, higher level engagement with these organizations. And that's what organizations are desperate for, right? And what they're doing is just operational life support. It's not great for the partner because it commoditizes their team. So their best people end up doing this repetitive validation work instead of the transformation advisory work that actually differentiates the firm and what most folks are going into consulting and going into these strategic services are wanting to do. The second dimension, right, is this backlog growth and that release fatigue that you commented on earlier. 88%. I mean, almost all organizations have increased their cloud application investment year over year. All these organizations are spending more, but are they getting more? Some of that could be a bit subjective, and it could be, depending on, or change be different from organization to organization. But in many cases, no, because they can't operationalize the new features fast enough. I mean, we see organizations all the time. They went live back in 2019, 2022. It's now 2026, and there's upgrades that are happening really exceptional innovation. I mean, we haven't even really spoken about all the agentic AI capabilities that are now being brought to bear in these ERPs, and they're still trying to navigate, UI UX changes, right? Adding new fields and adding some, a few features here and there, but they haven't been able to adopt that, right? So those innovations are just sitting on a shelf, and that backlog grows. And I mean, you talk about that the tension. I mean, we talk to customers all the time. That tension is real. They know that they're not getting the full value, full investment in their cloud applications, and they're desperate to consume that and actually start to see that come bear fruit in their company, right? So the team is so busy keeping up with the mandatory updates that they never get to the optional ones that would actually drive real business value. And lastly, the third is just the loss of institutional knowledge. When the operational work to keep the lights on lives primarily with the external partners, that knowledge of how the system actually works, the configuration decisions, the integration logic, the business rules that are embedded across the setup, that knowledge walks out the door at the end of every engagement. We see it time and time again. We talked about it earlier. I mean, that documentation gets built, it gets deployed to the customer, but folks have multiple hats. They're doing multiple jobs on a given day. A lot of that documentation simply gets lost or is not maintained over time, right? So it's just that debt kind of builds up quite significantly, right? So the client becomes dependent on people who don't, work for them, don't necessarily have that long-term skin in the game at that organization. And then lastly, is like the irony behind all this. I think organizations initially moved to the cloud so they could become more agile, more innovative, but the operating model around it has made them less agile than they were with on-premise, because at least on-premise, they had control of the pace of change and had that broader kind of understanding and could kind of scale at their own pace. But in the cloud environment, you really have to be on your toes and be up to speed and willing and able to take on those changes that are kind of coming at you on a consistent basis, but it can build up over time, right? So organizations move to cloud, but the operating model has made them less agile than on-prem to begin with.
Yeah. No, 100%. And that links quite nicely to my next point. So if the current model obviously is creating friction, what changes when organizations stop treating ERP as a series of events and start running it as a continuous operation? I mean, what's different about how teams work day to day, how decisions get made, and how change is actually absorbed by the business?
Yeah, look, everything changes, right? And I think this is part of the conversation that should really excite the partner community the most, because this shift doesn't eliminate the need for partners. It elevates exactly what those partners get to do for the customers. And again, I think this is why I joined Opkey to begin with, is to be a part of bringing about this kind of fundamental shift and change in method and really opportunity for organizations to get the most out of their cloud investment, and then operationalize and optimize that going forward. So three things I think change fundamentally when you move to a continuous and I would say autonomous operating model, right? So first, discovery becomes continuous itself. Instead of scrambling after a release drops to figure out what changed and what it means, you have systems, right? You have AI powered systems that automatically analyze release notes, map changes to your specific configuration, and flag exactly what needs attention. Just shameless plug here at Opkey, we have our Oracle Release Advisor. We have a Workday Release Advisory that's going to be available to our customers, right? That does exactly that. It's going to tell you what changes are coming in a particular release, can go to a next level of actually looking in your cloud environment and specifying, what really having a bespoke release report that can tell you exactly what changes are going to impact you, how they're going to impact you, recommend what changes that you really focus your expertise and analysis on from an individual business perspective. And these tools are available today, right? So for a partner, that means you walk into a client conversation with the answers right at your fingertips, right? Instead of spending the first 2 weeks doing discovery and doing analysis of an engagement, trying to understand what the current state is with these tools, you have it right there in front of you. And second, I think, this is our bread and butter here at Opkey, but is the testing becomes autonomous. So if you're an organization or if you're an SI partner supporting AMS, doing those managed services for a customer, instead of manually scripting tests, maintaining them quarter after quarter or month to month and hoping that they cover enough, you have AI agents, right, that can do discovery of real business processes in your application, generate those test scripts, also self heal when the UI changes. I mean, we have customers all the time. I think this is the biggest, kind of breaking point with automated testing and any kind of, test automation that folks are trying to do. Those things break immediately if or typically, when you make some kind of UI change where you make a field required that wasn't required previously. And these are changes that happen on the fly, right? You might get a request from the business for one reason or another to make these changes to the UI UX. Those don't always get the rigorous updates and attention that they need, and so you don't find out until a week or two, a month later, when you're preparing for that quarterly release cycle, that now your regression testing is broken because of that simple UI change, right? So with tools like Opkey's test agent, right, we can self heal with that UI change, and without skipping a beat, you've already got a working regression test, even though you've made some changes to the UI UX. So allows you, right, to focusing on effort or focusing that effort on what actually changed, not just rerunning everything from scratch. So going back again to kind of the work that partners are doing for customers, right? For a partner, this means your team is not spending 2/3 of their time of a release cycle on regression testing, right? They're spending time with the customer, with the folks that are boots on the ground using the application, working on those exceptions, right? The edge cases, the things that actually materially matter to the business, and that also require human judgment and kind of that strategic lens that most consultants are eager to provide to their customers. And then lastly, George, I mean, third, documentation and training become living artifacts, right? Talk about, again, these change management materials, these user guides, training aids, job aids. These things get built as part of the initial implementation. But again, they go on a shelf, they get put out as part of user acceptance testing. But more often than not, within a quarter or certainly within a year or so, those user guides become a bit obsolete or they become incorrect because there have been some changes to either the approval workflows. There's been changes to the UI UX. We talked about various fields that might get added or changed. And those user guides, right? Somebody has to go and update them in a normal, conventional way. But with automation, this becomes a non-factor, right? You have a training agent, you have a capability that's AI driven that can update and self-heal those user guides in the same manner that we're talking about with the test scenario updates, right? So users can adapt to change faster because the guidance that goes along with it is always current. And when you put all this together, this goes back to the cloud application lifecycle management, or CALM. This is not just a tool, right? It's an operating model. And the data shows that this isn't a fringe idea. I'll leave you with the last couple of stats, right? Gartner predicts that 40% of enterprise applications will embed AI agents by the end of 2026. And that's up from 5% just last year. And lastly, PwC found that 88% of senior executives, I mean, this is top of mind for
Right.
everybody, are increasing AI budgets specifically for agentic capabilities. So this is going mainstream, and it's going mainstream fast.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. I mean, 40% to implement AI agents by the end of 2026. I mean, I've, I don't know if it sounds very bold. It'd be good to understand, obviously, how many have done that already. But yeah, I think it's going to make a massive change to the industry, and I think hopefully for the good. I think businesses are going to become more efficient, and as you mentioned, I don't think partners need to be fearful of this integration, because there's going to be there's a different type of work where they can support and help their customers. I mean, from sort of Adam Jones' perspective, working with a fantastic team at Opkey, and from your sort of personal view, or the perspective you have, if you were advising an executive team responsible for ERP over the next 5 years. They're facing increasing release velocity, increasing interaction complexity, and constant pressure to deliver more with less. What is the single biggest assumption they need to challenge to stop ERP from being a constant source drag and turn it into something that continuously drives the business forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the single biggest assumption, and we hear this from executive teams and from the partner leadership alike, is simply that keeping the lights on is just the cost of doing business, and there's no way to fundamentally change it. That assumption says releases are coming, organizations staff up, they test what they can, we deal with the fallout, and we do it again next quarter, and you rinse and repeat, and that's just life these days, right? That is an acceptance of that operational drag, really just as a permanent fact of life, right? And it caps the value that both the client and the partner can retain from that relationship, right? And our data suggests that assumption is simply wrong, right?
Mm.
And that experience that you talked about. I mean, look, 83% of IT leaders told us that they would adopt agentic AI for lifecycle management. Not a single respondent of the over 200 folks that we spoke to rejected the concept outright. I mean, 0%, right? Everyone is interested in this and sees the opportunity. 69% expect that it would save them approximately 5,000 to 30,000 hours annually, which is roughly equivalent to 2 to 14 full-time employees worth of capacity, right? And I'll get back to that in a moment, but 81% believe agentic AI will deliver more value than the standard AI tools that they've seen so far, which, most people are familiar with the chatbots, the co-pilots, even RPA, robotic process automation. Everybody's kind of seen that, but we've moved well beyond that, right? And folks believe that that agentic AI truly will be a game changer and will be a table stakes part of the business going forward, right? But here's the stat that I think tells you this isn't just about cutting costs, right? When we asked how organizations would reinvest those freed up resources, going back to that number, right? Your thousands, 5,000 to 30,000 man hours, if you will. The number one answer of how do we reallocate those resources tied at 42%, right? Improving the employee experience and innovating on new business capabilities, right? It's not about shrinking budgets. It's about reinvesting and really bringing the business and the employees to a thriving state. People want to do higher value work, right? Right now, the problem is they're just trapped in that daily grind that we kind of spent the first half talking about. So to wrap it up, I mean, my message to executive teams, to the partner community that supports them is simply this, right? Stop accepting that operational drag is inevitable. The technology now exists to run your application lifecycle with AI at the center. The organizations and the partners that make this shift in the next 12 to 18 months are certainly going to have the competitive advantage, right? The ones that don't, I mean, they're going to be spending more every year just to stand still. And for partners specifically, this is a moment to decide what your firm is going to be known for, right? Are you the firm that helps clients thrive in this constant innovation and change, or the one that helps them clean up after it? right? I think that's the real question that all partners are kind of are faced with and asking right now.
Yeah, 100%. I think, yeah, it's such a pivot point within the industry where we're heading with AI, and it's really going to shape how businesses operate from end customers, vendors, partners. I think it's going to impact everybody who works within the community. But thank you for your insight today, and like I'd love to include that report below this video on all of our channels. So YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok. We'll have this link below so the audience can look at these stats and what Opkey are also providing. But yeah, thank you so much for joining the ERP perspective today. And is there anything else that you'd like to give to the audience before we go?
Yeah, no, George, I appreciate the opportunity. It's always great to be a part of the ERP perspective and be able to provide our spin on it. But no, I think it's an exciting time. I think everyone generally feels, this moment that we're in. But I think folks, organizations, partners that really embrace the moment are the ones that are going to really just thrive in the days ahead. And again, going back to that pace of innovation, I think you're only going to see it accelerate from here. So now's the time, and now's the moment to take advantage. But again, and of course happy to provide you with that report, and we'll get that out to your audience.
Well, yeah, it's been a great show. We're talking about he isn't broken, but the way you operate it is. I've been joined by Adam Jones at Opkey, and I've been your host as always, George Collier. Please feel free to like, follow, and subscribe, and also follow Adam Jones and Opkey, who I will link below.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me.